Imagine building a company entirely from scratch. You have absolutely zero profits.
Right.
You've only been in operation for, what, 16 months?
Right.
And yet, on just a random August afternoon, Wall Street decides to value your upstart company at nearly $3 billion.
It's mathematically absurd.
It is. But in the span of just a few hours, that's exactly what happened. Today, we're looking at the company that pulled off that exact miracle.
A miracle that quite literally engineered the foundational architecture of the modern commercial internet.
Exactly, only to be, systematically hunted, dismantled, and ultimately reduced to dust within a single decade.
Yeah.
We are diving deep into the meteoric rise and the catastrophic collapse of Netscape Communications Corporation.
And the historical footprint of this single corporate entity, it's really difficult to overstate.
Absolutely.
To genuinely understand the modern digital economy, the one you interact with every single day, you have to understand the exact mechanics of Netscape's ascent.
And the brutal nature of its destruction.
Right. So we're pulling from an extensive, highly empirical stack of source material for this investigation today.
We're talking hard data.
Exactly.
Right.
We're going to examine Netscape's initial financial prospectuses, unpack highly classified internal corporate memos from rival executives.
Some really shocking stuff in there, honestly.
Oh, yeah. And we'll review direct court testimonies from the landmark United States v. Microsoft antitrust trial and really dig into rigorous historical analyses of the dot-com era.
So we want to invite you, the listener, to step back with us into the mid-1990s. We're going to chart this trajectory meticulously.
Starting with that unprecedented peak.
Right. How they achieved total product dominance, secured that staggering financial valuation we mentioned, and effectively ignited the dot-com boom.
And then we have to deconstruct the rapid, brutal decline.
The browser wars.
The browser wars, yeah. The industrial siege, engineered by their primary competitor, the fatal internal missteps made by Netscape's own engineering teams, and the final dissolution of the brand.
But to understand the sheer scale of the disruption here, we have to establish what the digital landscape actually looked like right before Netscape arrived.
Because it was not pretty.
No, it wasn't. In 1994, the internet was just not a place for the average consumer.
Far from it. I mean, if we look at the data provided by the International Data Corporation IDC for mid-1995, the numbers paint a stark picture.
It was a deeply fragmented, highly technical ecosystem.
Right. So globally, there were approximately 57 million internet users, but that number is highly deceptive.
How so?
Well, out of those 57 million, only an estimated 8 million were actually navigating the World Wide Web.
Okay, hold on. Let's clarify that distinction for a moment because it's vital.
Yeah, please do.
Today, people use the terms the internet and the web interchangeably, but they aren't the same thing at all.
Not at all.
The internet is the physical infrastructure. It's the wires, the servers, the actual hardware connecting computers globally.
Right.
The World Wide Web is just one specific way of accessing information over that infrastructure.
Exactly. It's an application running on top of it.
Right. So if only 8 million people were on the web, what were the other 49 million users actually doing?
The vast majority were locked inside private, closed networks.
Walled gardens.
Yeah, dial-up walled gardens, things like CompuServe, Prodigy, or the early iterations of America Online.
Okay.
Or they were just using basic email protocols or navigating raw data through systems like Gopher or FTP.
Which required knowing specific command line prompts. It was not user-friendly.
No, the web itself at that time was largely undiscovered by non-technical users because it was incredibly hostile to them.
Hostile is a good word for it.
To retrieve even basic information, you often needed complex HTML and HTTP coding knowledge.
It was overwhelmingly text-based, static, and just entirely unintuitive.
The environment was built strictly for academics, government agencies, and computer scientists who were, sharing research papers.
Which perfectly sets the stage for the genesis of Netscape. Down at the National Center for Supercomputing Applications, the NCSA at the University of Illinois, a team had developed an early browser called Mosaic.
And Mosaic was a massive step forward.
It was. But there was a fundamental ideological split within the institution.
Right, between the academic mindset and the commercial mindset.
Exactly. Some of the programmers looked at Mosaic and saw the embryonic stages of mass-market commercial revolution.
But the academic institution, they did not share that commercial vision at all.
No, they didn't. And that ideological friction led to a critical fracture.
In 1994, Jim Clark, who is the highly successful founder of the hardware company Silicon Graphics, recognized this massive, untapped potential.
He saw the future.
He did. So he teamed up with Mark Andreessen, who was just 24 years old at the time.
24.
Yeah, and Andreessen had been the lead UNIX coder for that original Mosaic team at the University of Illinois.
So they joined forces.
Together, they founded Mosaic Communications.
So they had to change that name pretty quickly, didn't they?
They did. After a swift legal challenge from the NCSA regarding the trademark name Mosaic, they rebranded the venture as Netscape Communications Corporation.
And the culture they built there immediately was the quintessential myth-making Silicon Valley startup environment.
Oh, it was intense.
The engineering effort required to bring their first product to market was staggering. Source documents reveal that the coders, many of whom were hired directly out of that original NCSA team, were working brutal 120-hour weeks.
It's just hard to even fathom that level of burnout.
Right, but the objective was insanely ambitious. They wanted to create a browser that operated flawlessly across the major entirely distinct platforms of the time.
Which were UNIX, Apple, and Windows operating systems.
Right, and they managed it. They released Netscape Navigator 1.0 on December 15, 1994.
And it featured a technological leap that fundamentally changed how human beings interacted with digital information.
It was called on-the-fly web page loading.
Yeah, and to understand why on-the-fly loading was a paradigm shift, you have to understand the agonizing user experience that preceded it.
It was so bad.
It really was. Before Netscape Navigator, if you wanted to load a web page on an early browser, the software operated synchronously.
Meaning everything had to happen in a strict order.
Exactly. You would click a link, and the browser would essentially freeze.
Just lock up entirely.
Right. You had to wait for the entire page, every single heavy image, every graphic, every block of text to download, completely over a slow dial-up modem before anything would display on your screen.
Just staring at a blank screen. It was an exercise in pure frustration.
It was unusable for the general public.
Let me try an analogy here to underscore the mechanics of this because it's just brilliant engineering.
Go for it.
The old way of loading a web page was like waiting for a construction crew to build an entire bridge before you were allowed to take a single step onto it.
You just stood on the riverbank, waiting.
Exactly. What Netscape did with on-the-fly loading was essentially let you start walking across the bridge while they were still laying down the planks in front of you.
That captures the mechanical shift perfectly, because what Netscape's engineers did was they decoupled the text rendering from the image downloading.
Ah, okay.
So the browser would instantly parse the lightweight HTML text and display it on your screen immediately.
So you could start reading right away.
Yes. And it would insert blank placeholder boxes where the heavy images were supposed to go.
While the text was already there.
Exactly. Those images would then continue to load in the background.
It sounds incredibly simple to us now.
It does, but in 1994, it rendered the web instantly readable over low bandwidth connections.
It fundamentally shifted the internet from a static, passive waiting experience into an interactive, real-time environment.
But they didn't stop at page loading. The subsequent releases pushed the technological boundary even further.
Right. Version 2.0 introduced JavaScript.
And the development of JavaScript is one of those legendary high-pressure engineering sprints.
It was co-developed with Sun Microsystems, right?
Yes, and created by an engineer named Brendan Eich in roughly 10 days.
10 days to write a foundational programming language? That's absurd.
It's incredible.
But what did JavaScript actually do that was so revolutionary? Like, why did a browser need its own programming language?
Because before JavaScript, a web page was effectively a digital brochure. It was read-only.
Like a PDF or something.
Exactly.
Excellent.
If you filled out a form, you had to hit submit, send the data all the way back to a server, wait for the server to process it, and wait for a new page to load.
Just to find out you missed a required field, probably.
Exactly. It was maddening. But JavaScript allowed developers to embed interactive, executable programs directly into the web page itself.
So the web page could now react to the user in real time.
Right inside the browser without constantly talking to the server.
They also introduced frames, didn't they?
They did. Frames allowed a single web page to be divided into independent, scrollable sections.
But most critically for the future of the global economy, Netscape integrated secure sockets layer, or SSL, encryption.
This is the linchpin.
It really is. If on-the-fly loading made the web usable, SSL made the web profitable.
Absolutely.
But the concept of encryption can be pretty dense for people. How did SSL actually solve the problem of buying things online?
Okay, think of the internet in 1994 as a crowded room where everyone is shouting to communicate.
Okay, a chaotic room.
Right. If you wanted to buy something and shouted your credit card number to a merchant, everyone in the room could hear it.
Any server routing your data could intercept it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So SSL introduced a system of public and private cryptographic keys.
How does that work in practice?
When your browser connected to a secure Netscape server, they engaged in a complex mathematical handshake. The server handed your browser a public key, which is basically an open padlock.
Okay, that fell.
Your browser put your credit card in a box, snapped the open padlock shut, and sent it back over the internet.
So even though the box was traveling through that crowded shouting room, it was mathematically scrambled.
Precisely. Only the merchant holding the unique private key could unlock that specific padlock.
And by partnering with financial institutions like MasterCard to develop these standards, Netscape unilaterally solved the fundamental security problem hindering electronic commerce.
They built the infrastructure for online shopping.
So we really have to look at this not just as an evolution, but as an ignition event.
Oh, without a doubt.
Netscape's specific architecture, the visual accessibility over slow connections, the interactivity of JavaScript, and the ironclad security of SSL didn't just improve the commercial web. It effectively birthed it.
And that technological superiority translated directly into a highly aggressive, deeply calculated business model.
According to the financial prospectuses in our sources, Netscape offered the browser for free to non-commercial and academic users.
Right, but they charged $39 for a personal edition and $99 for commercial licenses.
However, the browser itself was essentially a Trojan horse, wasn't it?
It completely was.
A loss leader to drive a much larger revenue engine.
The consumer browser market was entirely about establishing market share and standardizing the infrastructure. The real revenue engine was enterprise software.
Selling to corporations.
Exactly. Netscape was selling the high-powered server software used by corporations to build and run the secure websites that the Navigator browser was accessing.
And these web servers were incredibly lucrative. Our sources show they were selling for between $1,500 and $50,000 each.
Let's look at the actual breakdown from the financial data for the first quarter of 1995.
It's fascinating. The Netscape Commerce Server accounted for 32% of their total product revenues.
Wow.
And bundled packages, where a company bought both Netscape Navigator licenses and the Commerce Server, accounted for another 10%.
And don't forget service revenues.
Right, which included lucrative enterprise consulting, ongoing maintenance, and technical support. That added approximately 5% to 7% of total revenues in those early quarters.
They were laying down the tracks and they were selling the trains.
That is a perfect way to put it. And that strategy resulted in staggering market adoption.
Within just 4 months of Navigator's launch, an estimated 75% of the people on the internet were using Netscape.
4 months. That kind of adoption is terrifyingly fast.
By the summer of 1995, Navigator commanded over 70% of the emergent browser market.
And by 1996, that figure peaked at an estimated 86%.
Furthermore, because of that server strategy we just discussed, Netscape systematically dominated the highly lucrative corporate intranet market.
They rapidly captured 70% of the global Fortune 100 companies.
We are talking about massive, entrenched entities adopting Netscape's infrastructure.
Companies like AT&T, Lockheed Martin, Dow Jones, Hewlett-Packard, and McDonnell Douglas.
Well, which brings us to the defining financial moment of the era.
Netscape has absolute technological supremacy. They have terrifying market share.
Right. But when we actually crack open the pre-IPO financials from their 1995 prospectus, we uncover a massive, glaring financial paradox.
This blew my mind when I read it. For the first 2 quarters ending June 30, 1995, Netscape had generated $16.6 million in total revenues.
Which sounds great.
It does. But they had incurred total operating losses of $4.3 million.
Yeah, they were bleeding cash.
And the company explicitly stated in its legal filings that it expected to continue to operate at a loss for the foreseeable future.
Operating activities had generated $7.3 million in cash, sure, but they had burned through $22.1 million in investment activities,
including massive capital expenditures just to keep their own servers running.
Despite those losses, the leadership team realized they were sitting on a rocket ship that required massive fuel.
They needed cash badly.
So in early 1995, Netscape began exploring an initial public offering to fund their expected hypergrowth.
They needed to build cash reserves for strategic acquisitions and to gain mainstream corporate visibility.
Now, they had already raised capital through private placements. Jim Clark personally invested over $4 million.
The venture capital firm Kleiner Perkins invested $5 million.
And a consortium of media companies, which was orchestrated by Morgan Stanley, injected $18 million.
But taking a company public just 16 months after incorporation, a company that had never once turned a profit.
It was considered highly unorthodox by traditional Wall Street standards.
Highly unorthodox is an understatement. The date was August 9, 1995. The IPO was underwritten by two major players, Morgan Stanley and Hambrecht and Quist.
Netscape offered 5 million shares, initially targeting a modest price.
But demand pushed the opening offering to $28 per share.
And the anticipation on Wall Street was so intense that on the morning of the IPO, it caused a 2-hour order imbalance on the Nasdaq queue.
For context, an order imbalance means the market makers physically cannot open the stock for trading because the incoming buy orders so overwhelmingly outnumber the sell orders.
They literally couldn't find a price where supply and demand.
They broke the system. When trading finally officially opened, the stock didn't just climb, it exploded.
It spiked immediately to $71 per share.
It peaked during the day at $74.75 and eventually closed at $58.25.
To put that valuation into perspective, Netscape reached a market capitalization of $2.2 billion to $2.7 billion on its very first day of trading.
The Wall Street Journal published a comparison the next day that perfectly encapsulated the historical gravity and really the sheer absurdity of the moment.
What did they compare it to?
They pointed out that it had taken the massive defense contractor General Dynamics 43 years to reach a $2.7 billion valuation.
43 years.
Yes. It took Netscape, a company with no profits, massive cash burn, and a 16-month operating history, quote, about a minute.
That is just phenomenal. And the cultural impact of this event was heavily engineered by Netscape's leadership, specifically their marketing division.
They recognized they weren't just selling software. They were selling a vision of the future.
Yeah, they packaged their leadership triad into what Vice President of Marketing Mike Homer famously described as a Jedi Council.
I love looking at the archetypes they leaned into for this.
Yeah.
You had Jim Clark, the seasoned visionary tech pioneer. He was acting as Yoda.
And his 24% stake in the company became worth $566 million overnight.
Incredible. Then you had Mark Andreessen, labeled by Newsweek as the uber super wonder whiz kid of cyberspace.
Which is such a 90s phrase.
It really is. But he represented the raw, youthful engineering genius of the new medium. His 11% stake was suddenly worth $59 million.
And to balance that out, you had Jim Barksdale, the gentlemanly, highly experienced former CEO of Macaw Cellular.
He held a 10% stake. And Barksdale was brought in to provide, quote, adult supervision.
To assure Wall Street that real business fundamentals were being applied to all this chaotic growth.
The media hyperbole following the IPO was immediate and deafening. Newsweek called it a gold rush not seen about Northern California since Sutter's Mill.
While Fortune magazine, taking a much more traditional financial stance, called it nutty and labeled it the most hyped IPO in history.
But regardless of the editorializing, August 9, 1995 became known permanently in financial history as the Netscape moment.
It really did.
Wait, hold on. We have to pause and look at the math here because this is where the entire financial world pivots.
Absolutely.
You're telling me a 16-month-old company with $4.3 million in recent operating losses was suddenly worth nearly $3 billion.
Yeah.
How did institutional investors, people whose entire job is risk assessment and studying balance sheets, possibly justify that math in 1995? Did this specific IPO permanently break the traditional rules of market valuation?
It absolutely fractured the traditional metrics of valuation. Prior to Netscape, market valuation heavily relied on price-to-earnings ratios, physical assets, manufacturing capacity, historical profit margins.
Yeah, simple things.
Exactly. Netscape had none of that. The institutional investors in 1995 were not buying Netscape's current bleeding balance sheet.
What were they buying then?
They were buying a monopoly option on the future of human communication.
Right.
The underlying logic was ruthless but clear. If Netscape controlled the primary gateway to the internet, a gateway that already boasted 80% market share, they would eventually figure out how to extract massive economic rents from every transaction, advertisement, and interaction that occurred through that gateway.
So the product wasn't the software.
No.
The product was the bottleneck. They owned the toll booth to the digital future, and Wall Street was betting they'd eventually figure out what the toll should be.
Exactly. Netscape's IPO empirically proved to the market that venture capital and retail investors would richly reward massive user acquisition and technological dominance over immediate profitability.
Growth became the only metric that mattered.
Yes. And this exact psychological shift provided the financial blueprint, the permission structure, really, for the entire dot-com bubble that followed over the next 5 years.
But that $2.7 billion valuation didn't just make Mark Andreessen rich and reshape Wall Street. It effectively painted a massive, glowing target on Netscape's back.
Because over in Redmond, Washington, Bill Gates was watching.
He was looking at that 80% market share, looking at how the browser functioned, and realizing his entire Windows operating system empire was suddenly facing an existential threat.
This is where the narrative shifts violently from a triumphant corporate ascent to an industrial scorched earth siege.
The gravity of the threat, Netscape posed to Microsoft, was documented explicitly by Bill Gates in a highly confidential, widely circulated 1995 warning memo to his executive team.
Famously known as the Internet Tidal Wave memo.
Right. Gates was a ruthless strategist, and he recognized immediately that Netscape was not merely a web browser. Netscape was a platform.
He wrote to his team, and I'll quote from the source here, "A new competitor born on the internet is Netscape. Their browser is dominant with a 70% usage share, allowing them to determine which network extensions will catch on."
And then he gets to the real fear.
Right. He continues, "They are pursuing a multi-platform strategy where they move the key API into the client to commoditize the underlying operating system."
Let's unpack the technical gravity of that specific phrase. Commoditize the underlying operating system, because this is the core of the entire browser war.
It is the whole battle.
We need to understand what an API is. API stands for Application Programming Interface. Think of it as the synapse where software applications connect to an operating system to function.
Right.
Historically, developers wrote their applications, word processors, games, accounting software, specifically for the Windows API.
Meaning, if a developer wrote for Windows, the consumer had to buy a Windows computer to run that software.
That dynamic locked consumers in and created the massive Windows monopoly.
But Netscape's browser was cross-platform. It ran on Windows, yes, but it also ran on Apple and UNIX systems.
And that cross-platform capability was the weapon, because Netscape was introducing its own APIs through technologies like JavaScript and plugins. They were creating a layer of middleware.
Yes, and if software developers started writing their applications for Netscape's APIs instead of Windows APIs,
those applications would run on any computer that had Netscape installed.
the computer's underlying operating system would suddenly cease to matter.
Whether you had a cheap UNIX box, an Apple Mac, or an expensive Windows machine, the user experience would be identical because the browser was doing all the heavy lifting.
Windows would be reduced from an essential, high-margin platform to an irrelevant, interchangeable commodity.
Microsoft realized that if the browser became the dominant computing platform, their entire operating system monopoly would collapse.
Their response was calculated and highly aggressive.
The Department of Justice later investigated this and described a broad pattern of conduct by Microsoft designed specifically to exclude or eliminate this middleware threat.
Though initially Microsoft actually attempted a kind of market division, didn't they?
They did. According to court documents, Microsoft executives met with Netscape and proposed a division of territory.
Like mob bosses dividing up a city.
Basically, Microsoft suggested that Netscape agree not to offer its browser and APIs for use on Windows 95, essentially abandoning the largest market in the world.
And in exchange
for Microsoft allowing Netscape to dominate the browser market for niche, non-Windows operating systems like Mac and UNIX.
Netscape, recognizing this as a death sentence for their platform ambitions, just outright rejected the proposal.
Upon that rejection, Microsoft's response was uncompromising.
On December 7, 1995, a date that Netscape veterans ominously and permanently referred to as Pearl Harbor Day, Microsoft announced its comprehensive Internet strategy.
The cornerstone of that strategy was their competing product, Internet Explorer.
And Microsoft announced that Internet Explorer would be given away for free.
Not as a trial, not just for non-commercial users. Free forever, to everyone.
The internal strategy driving this decision at Microsoft was laid bare during the subsequent antitrust trial.
One of the most chilling testimonies came from Intel Vice President Stephen McGeady.
McGeady testified regarding a November 1995 meeting he had with Microsoft Senior Vice President Paul Maritz.
According to McGeady, Under oath, Merritt's explicitly outlined a three-part strategy to deal with the Netscape threat.
First, give away Internet Explorer for free.
Second, integrated so deeply into the Windows operating system that it couldn't be removed.
And third, use this leverage to, quote, cut off Netscape's air supply.
While Merritt's later denied using that exact phrasing, another Intel executive, Ron Whittier, corroborated the aggressive tone.
Yeah, he testified that the term smother was openly used to describe their intent for Netscape.
To execute this smothering strategy, Microsoft mobilized resources on a scale that a startup simply could not match.
They spent over $100 million a year purely on the development of Internet Explorer.
By 1999, they had deployed more than 1,000 software developers to work full-time on a product that generated absolutely zero direct revenue.
Bill Gates articulated the lethal predatory mathematics of this strategy in 1996, stating it plainly to the press.
He said, "Our business model works even if all internet software is free. We are still selling operating systems. What does Netscape's business model look like? Not very good."
Furthermore, Microsoft utilized its existing monopoly power to forcefully control the channels of distribution.
They didn't just offer Internet Explorer for free. They began bundling it directly with the Windows operating system.
So it was the default browser sitting on the desktop when a consumer turned on a new PC.
And the Department of Justice also found that Microsoft entered into highly anti-competitive agreements with internet content providers and PC manufacturers, legally strong-arming them into excluding Netscape.
The testimony regarding the PC manufacturers is incredible. Compaq, one of the biggest PC makers at the time, attempted to pre-install Netscape Navigator on its computers to give their customers the best web experience.
Because it was still the better browser.
Right. But when Microsoft found out, they threatened to revoke Compaq's Windows license entirely.
Think about that. If Compaq can't install Windows, Compaq ceases to exist as a company.
Jim Barksdale, Netscape CEO, testified about this dynamic, stating it was the most unsettling period of his 33-year corporate career.
He noted the sheer mafia-like audacity of a competitor, blatantly implying they should either stop competing or face total corporate assassination.
Microsoft was weaponizing its monopoly in one-market operating systems to artificially subsidize a war in a completely different market web browsers.
And this is where we have to look closely at the mechanics of this siege. Microsoft's tactic here wasn't merely out-innovating a rival.
No, they weren't just building a better browser.
This was scorched earth siege warfare. By giving Internet Explorer away for free and burning $100 million a year to do it, Microsoft effectively poisoned the water supply of Netscape's entire consumer revenue model.
Because who's going to pay $39 for Netscape Navigator when Internet Explorer is sitting right there on the desktop for $0?
Exactly. Was there any mathematical way for a standalone software company to survive an adversary that is willing to burn hundreds of millions of dollars to distribute a competing product for zero revenue?
The blunt, analytical answer is no. Mathematically, a standalone company whose primary product is artificially devalued to zero by a monopolist cannot survive on that product line.
Netscape's consumer revenue model was structurally annihilated.
Their only viable mathematical path to survival was to retreat entirely to the high-margin enterprise server market.
But even there, Microsoft was aggressively pushing its own Internet Information Server.
Right. Or Netscape had to invent an entirely new monetization model, which they attempted by turning their browser homepage into a massive advertising portal called NetCenter.
But competing directly on browser sales was mathematically unwinnable against an adversary, subsidizing the battle with the limitless cash flow of an operating system monopoly.
But while Microsoft mercilessly battered the gates from the outside, the documentary evidence reveals that Netscape did not just fall victim to external forces.
They began making catastrophic, unforced engineering errors from within.
The intense, paranoid pressure of the browser wars fundamentally altered Netscape's product strategy, and not for the better.
In 1997, reacting to Microsoft's relentless updates, Netscape released Netscape Communicator 4.0.
Instead of remaining a lean, fast, highly optimized web browser, which was the core product users actually loved, Communicator was a massive bloated bundle of software.
They attempted to pivot toward corporate workflow management. The software included web editors, complex email applications, address books, and collaboration tools.
This shift triggered a massive internal revolt among their own engineering team.
One of Netscape's earliest and most brilliant engineers, Jamie Zawinski, authored a devastating internal critique of this pivot.
He diagnosed the company with a terminal case of featureitis.
meaning prioritizing the addition of useless corporate features over the fundamental stability and speed of the core browser.
Zawinski wrote bluntly that the product's entire direction had fundamentally changed. He argued they had stopped building products that real people, or as he famously put it, our moms, actually wanted to use.
By January 1998, Zawinski's internal assessment concluded that Netscape was, quote, shipping garbage and shipping it late.
Ouch.
Yeah. This severe loss of focus and the resulting bloat contributed to the layoff of 300 workers in early 1998, which was nearly 10% of their entire workforce.
But the featureitis and bloat of Communicator 4.0 was relatively...
So the engineers convinced management that rewriting from scratch would make future updates faster.
But as software engineer Joel Spolsky noted in his famous analysis of this specific disaster, throwing away the whole program is a dangerous folly.
Why?
Because that messy, ugly old code contains years of accumulated bug fixes. It contains solutions to thousands of weird edge cases that users encountered in the real world.
By deciding to rewrite from scratch, Netscape voluntarily threw away all that accumulated knowledge.
And paralyzed its own product development for 3 years while they reinvented the wheel.
And in the late 1990s, 3 years was an absolute eternity.
An eternity.
By stepping off the battlefield to rebuild their weapons from scratch, this unforced error granted Microsoft unimpeded time.
Microsoft used those 3 years to rapidly iterate Internet Explorer, fix its own bugs, refine its features, and achieve absolute technical parity, if not outright superiority.
All without facing any new competitive pressure from Netscape.
Exactly. And while Netscape's engineers were struggling with the massive burden of the rewrite, the company suffered a crushing distributional death blow on the business side.
Lou Montulli, another foundational engineer at Netscape, identified the single most devastating event in this period: the loss of America Online.
We mentioned AOL earlier as a walled garden, but by this time they had become the undisputed behemoth of consumer internet access.
AOL represented a staggering 35% of all global internet traffic.
When you sent an email or browsed the web in 1997, there was a 1 in 3 chance you were doing it through AOL.
And crucially, AOL was using Netscape's browser engine as their default software.
Microsoft recognized the immense strategic value of AOL's user base. They knew that if they could flip AOL, they could instantly rewrite the market share route.
So Microsoft approached AOL with an offer Netscape physically could not match. Microsoft offered AOL highly coveted placement directly on the Windows desktop.
They would put an AOL icon right next to the recycle bin on millions of new PCs.
That was prime digital real estate that Netscape, as a mere software application, had absolutely no authority to offer.
In exchange for this desktop placement, AOL agreed to switch its default browser engine from Netscape to Internet Explorer.
The impact was violent and immediate. When that deal was executed, Netscape's market share plummeted from approximately 90% down to 65%, or 70% practically overnight.
And that sudden drop triggered a catastrophic chain reaction across the entire internet ecosystem.
When a full third of the internet suddenly shifts to Internet Explorer, the people building the websites, the web content developers, can no longer ignore Microsoft.
They stop building websites optimized exclusively for Netscape's unique features, and they start building sites specifically to accommodate Microsoft's standards.
Or at least to be compatible with both. Netscape was suddenly stripped of its unique technical advantages. They were no longer the platform. They were reduced back to a mere commodity.
This specific sequence of events, the predatory free bundling, the internal rewrite paralysis, and the loss of the AOL distribution channel severely compromised Netscape's financial viability.
By early 1998, Netscape reported slowing growth and its first quarterly operating loss since becoming profitable in 1996.
Desperate to regain momentum and weaponize their user base against Microsoft, they declared Navigator completely free for everyone.
Furthermore, they made a radical move. They open-sourced their code.
They released the blueprint of their browser to the public, an act that birthed the Mozilla Foundation.
But as a strategy to save the corporate entity of Netscape Communications Corporation, it was far too late.
Way too late.
History largely remembers this era with a simple narrative. Microsoft's predatory pricing and illegal bundling killed Netscape.
That's the common story.
But looking at the timeline, what if Netscape hadn't shot themselves in the foot? If Netscape had maintained strict code discipline, if they had avoided the massive groupware bloat of Communicator 4.0, and crucially, if they had not spent 3 years paralyzing themselves by rewriting their software from scratch, Could they have retained their user base strictly on product superiority, despite Internet Explorer being bundled for free?
It is the critical analytical counterfactual of this entire era.
Right.
Because product superiority commands intense, sticky user loyalty, especially among power users and developers.
Had Netscape rapidly released a lean, lightning-fast, highly stable version 5.0 in 1998, they would have forced Microsoft to continuously play catch-up on feature innovation.
They would have kept the technological high ground. However, product superiority alone cannot completely overcome a structural distribution monopoly.
Free distribution pre-installed on 90% of the world's computers via Windows, combined with the loss of the massive AOL user base, created an insurmountable gravitational pull for the average consumer.
So, Netscape's internal engineering hubris did not kill the company in a vacuum, but it drastically accelerated the timeline of their defeat.
It effectively removed the one defensive shield they had, technological excellence, at the exact moment Microsoft's battering ram breached the gates.
Which brings us to the final phase of Netscape's existence, a period marked by a bitter, historic legal victory that completely failed to save the company.
Followed by a slow, agonizing death inside a massive corporate conglomerate.
The tactical aggression deployed by Microsoft didn't just hurt Netscape, it triggered massive regulatory scrutiny from the United States government.
The Department of Justice, heavily influenced by a comprehensive 1996 white paper authored by Silicon Valley antitrust attorney Gary Reback, initiated a landmark lawsuit, US v. Microsoft.
The core argument from the DOJ was that Microsoft had illegally tied Internet Explorer to its Windows operating system, specifically to protect its OS monopoly and unlawfully stifle competition in the middleware market.
The trial itself produced some of the most damning internal corporate evidence in modern business history.
We already discussed the testimonies regarding Paul Maritz and the strategy to cut off air supply.
But the DOJ uncovered a mountain of internal Microsoft documents, explicitly outlining the strategy to crush Netscape through integration.
For example, a January 5, 1997 presentation delivered directly to Bill Gates stated plainly that integrate with Windows was the fundamental way to increase IE share.
The intent was undeniable. In March 1997, Microsoft executive Kumar Mehta wrote a memo concluding that it is a mistake to release Memphis, which was the codename for Windows 98, without bundling IE with it.
Furthermore, an internal analysis noted the chilling reality of consumer behavior. It stated that if Windows and IE are decoupled, Navigator has a good chance of winning, and most Nav users will never switch to us.
Brad Chase, another senior executive, explicitly wrote in April 1997 that Windows 98 was, quote, a key weapon in the IE share battle.
The government also demonstrated that Microsoft used its market power to thwart cross-platform threats beyond just the Netscape browser.
Sun Microsystems had developed Java technology, which Netscape distributed heavily within its browser.
And Java was designed with the philosophy of write once, run anywhere, meaning a Java application could run on any operating system.
The court found that Microsoft deliberately developed a modified, incompatible version of Java specifically for Windows.
Their goal was to undermine this cross-platform portability, tricking developers into writing Java programs that would only work on Windows, thereby protecting the application's barrier to entry that secured the Windows monopoly.
On April 3, 2000, after a grueling trial that captivated the tech industry, Judge Thomas Penfield Jackson issued his final verdict.
He ruled decisively that Microsoft had indeed abused its monopoly power and had broken U.S. antitrust laws.
He later issued a structural remedy, ordering that Microsoft be broken up into two separate companies, one for the operating system and one for software applications.
While that specific breakup order was eventually overturned on appeal, the core findings of monopolistic abuse were upheld.
But for Netscape, the verdict was entirely Pyrrhic.
It was a moral victory that provided absolutely no material relief.
While the trial was slowly grinding through the legal system, Netscape's financial position had become utterly untenable. On November 24, 1998, America Online acquired Netscape Communications in a stock swap transaction valued at $4.21 billion.
The tragic irony of this acquisition cannot be overstated.
America Online, the very company whose defection to Internet Explorer had triggered Netscape's rapid market share collapse, was now buying the remnants of the company.
As one of our source analysts pointed out, it is deeply bizarre to imagine a company spending over $4 billion on a browser company just to throw away the client software.
Because AOL had already legally committed to using Internet Explorer, they had no use for Netscape Navigator.
Netscape effectively became a massive white elephant for AOL. The merger suffered from severe integration debt.
There was a profound, unbridgeable cultural clash between Netscape's engineering-driven open web DNA and AOL's closed, proprietary, highly corporate walled garden business model.
AOL's primary motivation for the acquisition appeared to be acquiring Netscape's heavily trafficked NetCenter web portal for advertising revenue and their highly profitable enterprise server business.
That server business was subsequently folded into a joint venture with Sun Microsystems called iPlanet.
The revolutionary browser development, the product that had changed the world, was relegated to a complete afterthought.
The final market share numbers serve as a forensic record of total decimation.
From a peak of 86% in 1996, Netscape fell to 51% by the end of 1997.
Internet Explorer officially overtook Netscape in September 1998.
By 2000, exactly as the antitrust verdict was being handed down, Internet Explorer controlled 80% of the market.
By 2003, Microsoft's market share hit an astonishing, monopolistic 95%.
Finally, on February 1, 2008, AOL officially discontinued all support and development for the Netscape browser. The brand was dead.
There's one vital postscript to this dissolution that we have to mention, because it shapes the internet we use today.
In 1998, recognizing their impending corporate defeat, Netscape made that radical decision to open source their browser code.
That act birthed the Mozilla Foundation.
Mozilla eventually utilized that open source code base to completely rebuild and release the Firefox browser.
So while the corporate entity of Netscape Communications Corporation died, its underlying code, its engineering philosophy, and its fierce commitment to open web standards survived.
Firefox eventually became the wedge that broke Microsoft's stagnant browser monopoly in the late 2000s.
It is a profound legacy. But looking at the timeline of the antitrust suit forces a critical analysis regarding the efficacy of regulatory intervention in the technology sector.
The central tragedy of the US v. Microsoft case is the extreme disparity in velocity between technological innovation and legal adjudication.
The difference between internet time and legal time.
Even though Netscape fundamentally proved their case in federal court, and Microsoft was found guilty of illegal practices, the slow gears of the justice system rendered the verdict completely useless for the actual victim it was meant to protect.
The DOJ didn't file its primary complaint until May 1998, and the initial verdict wasn't reached until April 2000.
In internet time, a 2-year delay is an entire epoch.
Precisely. By the time the court actually ordered Microsoft to cease its illegal exclusionary tactics, Netscape's market share had already collapsed.
Their consumer revenue model was destroyed, and the company had been entirely absorbed and marginalized by AOL.
The legal system operates retroactively on a scale of years. Network effects in software operate exponentially on a scale of months.
The verdict established vital legal precedents for future antitrust enforcement against tech monopolies, but as a mechanism for saving Netscape from an illegal siege in real time, it was structurally too slow to be of any material use.
We have reached the conclusion of our forensic examination into the peak-to-dust narrative of Netscape.
This historical record is unequivocal.
Netscape constructed the vital bridge to the commercial internet. Through the brilliant introduction of on-the-fly rendering, the interactivity of JavaScript, and the ironclad security of SSL encryption, they transformed a complex, text-based academic network into a mass-market, secure medium for global commerce.
They achieved a historic multi-billion-dollar valuation in just 16 months, permanently altering the psychology of capital markets and igniting the dot-com boom.
Yet, within a single decade, this pioneering titan was entirely dismantled, crushed by a combination of Microsoft's illegal, monopolistic siege warfare and their own fatal engineering hubris.
As we conclude this investigation, I want to leave you, the listener, with a final, massive, counterfactual implication to ponder.
We documented how Bill Gates famously feared that Netscape would commoditize the underlying operating system.
He feared the browser would become the ultimate computing platform, making Windows irrelevant.
But consider the long-term trajectory of computing today. We now live in a world dominated by web applications, cloud computing, and operating system agnostic platforms like Chrome OS.
If Netscape had actually survived, if they had successfully maintained their dominance, avoided the rewrite, and made the browser the primary computing platform by 1999, would the entire history of computing have shifted to the cloud a full 10 years earlier?
If Netscape had won, could they have fundamentally prevented the hardware and operating system monopolies that entirely defined the technology sector throughout the 2000s?
It is a profound question, and it underscores exactly how much of our modern digital infrastructure and the massive corporate power structures that govern it were forged in the fires of the browser wars.
We thank you for exploring this defining chapter of history with us today. Until next time.